The platform was deserted when Marie stepped onto it. A chilling wind howled through the empty station, unsettling the rows of metal benches and flickering old-fashioned lamps. She glanced at her watch. It was midnight, the time when people were either deep in their sleep or on their way to places they had no business being. Marie adjusted her coat, feeling the cold seep into her bones, and began pacing as she waited for the last train home. Her footsteps echoed across the platform, creating an eerie rhythm that seemed to blend with the distant hum of the train's approaching whistle. She felt a sense of unease creep over her, but dismissed it. It had been a long day at the office, and all she wanted was to get home, sink into her warm bed and forget the world for a few hours. Finally, the train arrived, obscured by a thick mist that seemed to cling to it like a shroud. The doors slid open with an unnatural hiss, revealing a dimly lit interior. The usual hum of activity and conversation was conspicuously absent. Marie hesitated before stepping inside, her instincts screaming for her to turn back. But the thought of another hour waiting in the cold made her forge ahead. The train was almost empty, save for a few scattered passengers who sat eerily still, like mannequins in a grotesque display. Marie picked a seat towards the middle of the car and pulled out her phone to distract herself. There was no signal, of course, and she sighed in frustration, shoving it back into her bag. Just as the train lurched forward, Marie noticed a man seated across from her. His face was pale, and his eyes were sunken and hollow, as if he hadn't slept in decades. He wore a tattered suit that seemed more fitting for a different era. Her skin prickled as he turned to look at her, a sorrowful expression etched onto his features. "Not from around here, are you?" the man asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Just trying to get home," Marie replied, forcing a smile. "Long day at work." His eyes darkened with something close to pity. "A long day indeed, but the journey home might be longer than you think." Before she could respond, the lights flickered and the train seemed to plunge into an even deeper darkness. The few other passengers began to move, but their movements were mechanical, almost rehearsed. Marie's heart pounded as she watched one of the passengers, a young woman with a gaping wound on her temple, stand up and begin a slow, mournful walk down the aisle. The man leaned closer, his breath cold against her skin. "You're on the midnight train. We're all bound by our deaths, reliving them night after night. You must leave before you become one of us." Marie swallowed hard, every instinct telling her to run, yet her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. "How do I get out?" she whispered, terror tinging her voice. He shook his head, the pity in his eyes intensifying. "There's only one way. You must face the worst of us. Confront the conductor. If you can survive his wrath, you might just wake up." Before Marie could ask another question, the scene around her shifted. She was no longer in the dimly lit train car, but in a gruesome scene from what looked like a movie. The air was filled with screams, and the metallic scent of blood was almost overwhelming. She watched in horror as the young woman with the wound on her temple was thrown onto the tracks by an unseen force, her body crumpling in a sickening manner. Panicking, Marie turned to the man who'd spoken to her earlier, but he was gone. In his place stood another figure, more monstrous than human, the conductor. He wore a uniform, but his face was obscured by shadows, making his features indistinguishable. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This isn't your place." Marie backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I just want to go home." The conductor laughed, a dark, hollow sound that echoed through the nightmare. "Home? There is no home for you anymore. Not unless you can prove your worth." With those words, the train lurched again, and Marie was thrown into another horrific scene. This time, it was an elderly couple, their faces twisted in terror as they were trapped in a burning train car. The flames danced around them, and their screams filled the air, a symphony of agony that seemed to seep into her very soul. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see the young woman with the head wound. "You must face him," she said, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "It's the only way." Summoning every ounce of courage, Marie nodded. She turned to face the conductor, who was now advancing towards her. his form growing more grotesque with each step. The train continued to shift, throwing her into scenes of violence and despair, but she kept her focus on him, knowing that her survival depended on it. As the conductor reached out for her, Marie felt a surge of determination. "I won't become one of you," she screamed, driving her foot into his midsection. He doubled over, momentarily stunned, and she took the opportunity to run. The train was a labyrinth of nightmares, each car a new horror waiting to be faced. She passed passengers who were being suffocated, stabbed, and thrown from great heights. Their eyes followed her, hollow and desperate, as if begging her to save them. Finally, she found herself at the front of the train, where the conductor's control room was. The door was heavy, and it took all her strength to push it open. Inside, she was greeted by the sight of the conductor's true form, a skeletal figure draped in tattered robes, eyes glowing with malevolent fire. "You think you can escape?" he hissed, advancing on her. "No one escapes the midnight train." Marie glanced around, spotting a lever labeled emergency brake. With a burst of adrenaline, she lunged for it, her fingers grasping the handle before the conductor grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "You'll die here," he whispered, his breath foul and cold. "Maybe," she said, yanking the lever with all her might. The train screeched to a halt, throwing them both off balance. Marie used the momentary distraction to break free, running back through the train cars, which were now eerily silent. As she reached the last car, she saw the man in the tattered suit once more. He smiled sadly. "You've done it. For tonight, at least." "What do you mean, for tonight?" Marie asked, her voice shaking. "Some nightmares never truly end," he replied, his form beginning to fade. "But you've earned a reprieve. Use it wisely." The next thing she knew, she was back on the platform, the train gone, and the station bathed in the first light of dawn. She collapsed onto a bench, tears streaming down her face as the weight of what she'd experienced settled over her. Marie never took the midnight train again, and she always made sure to be home before dark. For as long as she lived, the memory of that night haunted her, a constant reminder that some rides are more than just a journey. They're a test of survival. Though she avoided the midnight train, Marie was not free from its grasp. Night after night, she found herself in cold sweats, reliving snippets of the horrors she had witnessed. The man with the tattered suit, the young woman with the head wound, and the skeletal conductor became fixtures in her nightmares. She could no longer enjoy simple pleasures. The sound of a train whistle sent shivers down her spine. Crowded places made her feel suffocated, reminiscent of the mechanical movements of the passengers she had seen. Every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. Desperate for peace, Marie sought out therapists and spiritual advisors. She tried everything from traditional counseling to more unconventional methods like hypnosis and exorcisms. Nothing seemed to erase the terror that had embedded itself in her psyche. One day, while browsing an old bookstore for solace, Marie stumbled upon a book titled "Surviving the Midnight Train." Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. It seemed to be a collection of similar experiences, each as chilling as her own. Determined to find others who shared her torment, Marie organized a gathering of those who had contributed to the book. They met in a small, dimly lit cafe, each person recounting their own haunting journey on the midnight train. There was a sense of kinship in their shared suffering, a small comfort in knowing she was not alone. Through these meetings, Marie learned that the midnight train had a history stretching back centuries. It seemed to serve as a purgatory for lost souls, each passenger bound by a past tragedy. The conductor was the gatekeeper, a relentless force that tested the resolve of those trapped in his domain. Driven by newfound resolve and supported by her new allies, Marie decided it was time to confront her nightmare head-on. She returned to the deserted platform at midnight, armed with the knowledge she had gathered and a steely determination to end her torment once and for all. As the familiar whistle echoed through the station, the mist-shrouded train arrived. Marie stepped onto it with a sense of purpose. She made her way through the train cars, facing the horrors that had once paralyzed her with a newfound strength. When she finally reached the conductor, She did not back away. Instead, she looked him in the eye and demanded her freedom. In that moment, the train seemed to dissolve into mist, and the figures around her faded away. Marie awoke on the platform as dawn broke. The weight she had carried for so long seemed to lift. She knew that while some nightmares never truly end, she had reclaimed her life from the midnight train. And for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of peace.